The meatpacking plant was a universe unto itself, a cold, sterile labyrinth of machinery, steel, and shadows. It thrived in the outskirts of town, its imposing structure a dark silhouette against the horizon. To outsiders, it was an industrial monolith that quietly churned out profits and provided steady jobs. To those who worked there, it was a place of quiet dread, where the hum of conveyor belts and the hiss of pneumatic tools could never quite drown out the unsettling stillness of the air. The chill inside was more than just temperature. It seeped into the bones, wrapping around the workers like an unshakable frost. Employees often joked that the cold wasn't from the freezers but from the plant itself, as though the building drew heat and life out of everything within it. Some laughed nervously, but others simply nodded in grim agreement. It was the kind of place where silence seemed to watch you, and shadows never behave quite as they should. It wasn't unusual for workers to share unsettling stories during their breaks, sipping coffee from stained thermoses under flickering fluorescent lights. Stories of tools turning on by themselves, faint whispers in the storage rooms, or the inexplicable feeling of being watched were as much a part of the job as the grueling hours. These tales were often dismissed as tricks of tired minds or overactive imaginations. After all, the night shifts were long, and the plant's stark, unwelcoming atmosphere could wear down anyone's nerves. One story, however, persisted among the crew. They called it the Butcher's Whisper. It was said that decades ago, a deranged worker had gone on a rampage in the plant, his mind twisted by the monotony and isolation of his job. He vanished without a trace after the incident, but workers claimed his spirit lingered, whispering to those who stayed late or worked alone. No one could agree on what the whispers said, only that they were soft, urgent, and unmistakably human. New hires often dismissed the stories as hazing rituals, but even the most skeptical found themselves looking over their shoulders after a few weeks on the job. The plant had a way of getting under your skin. Something about the rhythmic thrum of the machines, the endless rows of carcasses, and the oppressive cold seemed to erode logic and reason, leaving only unease. Tom was one of the newer employees, and he hated the place almost immediately. Fresh out of high school and desperate for a paycheck, he had taken the night shift despite the warnings from his friends. "That place will eat you alive," one of them had said, only half joking. Tom had laughed it off then, but now, standing alone in the cavernous cutting room, he wasn't so sure they were wrong. The room stretched endlessly before him, the stainless steel tables glinting faintly under dim overhead lights. The conveyor belt creaked and groaned as it carried its unrelenting load of raw meat. The air smelled of blood and disinfectant, a combination that clung to Tom's clothes and hair no matter how much he washed. He had been assigned to clean up after the day's shift, a task that felt as endless as the plant itself. As he worked, the silence began to press down on him. The usual hum of machinery had faded, leaving only the faint hiss of air escaping from the freezers. It wasn't just quiet. It was a void, a palpable absence of sound that seemed to amplify every small noise. The scrape of his brush against the floor echoed unnaturally, bouncing back at him from unseen corners. It was then that he heard it, a faint rustling, like fabric brushing against metal. He froze, his breath caught in his throat. The noise came again, closer this time. Tom turned toward the source, his heart pounding. The room was empty, just as it had been a moment ago. Yet the sound persisted, faint and fleeting, like a whisper carried on the wind. "Hello," Tom called out, his voice cracking. The word felt absurd in the vast emptiness, swallowed almost instantly by the cold. There was no response, only the faint creak of the conveyor belt in the distance. For a moment, Tom considered leaving, but the thought of explaining to his supervisor why the floor wasn't finished kept him rooted to the spot. As he returned to his work, the rustling stopped, replaced by something even more unsettling, a low, rhythmic tapping. It seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere, like the pulse of the building itself. Tom's hands trembled as he gripped the brush, his eyes darting around the room. He wanted to believe it was just his imagination, but deep down he knew better. The chill seemed to deepen, and the air grew heavier, pressing down on him like a weight. Tom wiped his forehead with the back of his hand, realizing with a start that it was clammy with sweat despite the freezing air. He turned toward the exit, deciding that whatever punishment awaited him for leaving early was preferable to staying another minute. As he stepped toward the door, the tapping stopped, replaced by a single, chilling sound, a soft, unmistakable whisper. The words were indistinct, but the tone was urgent, insistent, and utterly inhuman. Tom bolted, leaving his tools behind. The shadows seemed to stretch toward him as he ran, their shapes shifting in ways he dared not comprehend. By the time he burst through the exit and into the icy night air, he was gasping for breath. The plant loomed behind him, its darkened windows like empty eyes watching his retreat. For the first time, Tom understood what his friend had meant. The plant wasn't just a workplace. It was something else entirely, something alive and waiting. And tonight it had noticed him. The morning after Tom's harrowing encounter, the plant was as indifferent as ever. Its imposing structure, with its endless maze of machinery and chill-filled air, betrayed no sign of the night's events. Workers filed in for the day's shift, their chatter a mix of fatigue and resigned monotony. If anyone noticed Tom's abandoned cleaning supplies, no one mentioned it. The plant had a way of swallowing small mysteries whole, like meat ground into sausage. That day, Clara arrived for her first shift. She stood outside the plant for a moment, clutching the straps of her worn backpack. Her eyes scanned the towering building, taking in the grime-streaked windows and rusting pipes. There was something unreadable in her expression, part awe, part apprehension. Dressed in a faded hoodie and jeans, she looked younger than her 26 years, though her demeanor carried a weight that seemed older. Inside, the manager, Mr. Delaney, greeted her with the kind of practiced indifference reserved for new hires who rarely lasted a month. He was a wiry man with a perpetual scowl and a clipboard that never seemed to leave his hands. "You're late," he muttered, though Clara had arrived 10 minutes early. She didn't argue. Instead, she nodded and followed him through the labyrinthine corridors of the plant. As they walked, Delaney rattled off the basics: safety protocols, break times, the location of the lockers. His voice was flat, as though he were reading from a script he'd long since grown tired of. Clara responded with polite nods, her attention split between him and her surroundings. The deeper they ventured, the colder it became. Clara tugged her hoodie tighter, but the chill seemed to pierce through the fabric. The faint smell of blood and disinfectant grew stronger, mingling with the mechanical hum of the plant's machinery. As they passed through the cutting room, she noticed workers hunched over their stations, their faces blank with concentration. The metallic clinks of knives against steel echoed faintly, a grim rhythm to the work. "You'll be on the night shift," Delaney said abruptly, snapping her attention back. He glanced at her as if expecting an objection, but Clara merely nodded again. "Most people don't like it," he added, his voice tinged with an odd mix of challenge and warning. "Night's fine," Clara replied, her tone even. Delaney gave her a long look, then shrugged. "Suit yourself," he said. "Lockers at the end of the hall. Be here at 9 sharp. With that, he handed her a thin employee manual and walked off, his clipboard tucked under his arm. Clara watched him disappear around a corner before turning her gaze back to the cutting room. Something about the place gnawed at her, a faint unease that had settled in her chest the moment she stepped inside. It wasn't just the smell or the chill. It was the feeling that the plant was somehow aware of her. She brushed the thought aside. She wasn't here to feel comfortable. She was here to find answers. Later that evening, Clara returned for her first night shift. The plant felt different in the dark, its corridors more like tunnels and its shadows deeper, as if they had grown bolder without the sun. She passed the cutting room, now silent and empty, and made her way to the storage area where she'd been assigned. The room was cavernous, lined with metal shelves stacked high with supplies. As she began her tasks, the oppressive silence began to creep in. The only sound was the faint buzz of the overhead lights, which flickered every so often. She kept her movements steady, methodical, her mind focused on her work. But out of the corner of her eye, she thought she saw something, a shadow moving where there shouldn't have been one. Clara paused, her heart quickening. She turned toward the shelf, but there was nothing there. The room was still, the air heavy with cold. She forced herself to breathe, to keep moving. It was too early to let her nerves get the better of her. Yet as the hours wore on, the feeling of being watched grew stronger. Clara could almost sense eyes on her, tracking her every movement. She refused to give in to the fear, but her body betrayed her, the fine hairs on her arms standing on end. She tightened her grip on the mop handle, her knuckles white. When her shift ended, Clara made her way to the locker room with deliberate calm. She could feel the plant watching her as she left, its cold presence trailing her steps. She didn't look back. Whatever was lurking within these walls, she would uncover it, but not tonight. Clara wasn't just a new hire. She had come here for a purpose, and she wasn't leaving until she found it. The plant's night shift had always been a vacuum of sound and light, where shadows stretched and silence pressed against the chest like a weight. But for Clara, her second night on the job carried an intensity that was harder to explain. She arrived early, standing in the parking lot for a moment longer than necessary, staring at the hulking silhouette of the meatpacking plant. There was something unnatural about its stillness, even when no one was inside. The locker room smelled faintly of ammonia and metal, and the flickering overhead lights cast uneven shadows on the concrete walls. Clara had never liked fluorescents. They always made the world look sickly and flat. She opened her locker with a creak, her movements precise and deliberate. Inside, her reflection in the small, foggy mirror stared back at her, looking more tired than she felt. The storage area greeted her with its usual chill. The long rows of steel shelves seemed to stretch endlessly, filled with everything from spare machinery parts to cleaning supplies. Her task for the evening was simple: inventory. She pulled a clipboard off the wall and began methodically checking items against the list, her pen scratching faintly against the paper. It wasn't long before the whispers began. At first, they were barely audible, soft, indistinct murmurs that could have been the sound of air escaping from the freezers. But as the minutes ticked by, the voices grew more distinct. Clara froze mid-step, tilting her head toward the sound. It seemed to be coming from deeper within the storage area, beyond the rows she had yet to inspect. Her rational mind told her it was nothing. Perhaps the pipes or some rogue draft sneaking through the vents. But something deeper, a primal instinct, insisted otherwise. Taking a deep breath, Clara set down her clipboard and began walking toward the source of the whispers. The shelves grew more crowded and chaotic the farther she went, their orderly rows giving way to haphazard piles of dusty and used equipment. The air felt heavier here, the cold biting more sharply against her skin. The whispers, once faint, were now clearer, almost conversational. She couldn't make out the words, but the cadence was unmistakable, an urgent, hushed exchange between multiple voices. When she turned the final corner, she stopped dead in her tracks. The whispers ceased immediately. Before her was an old, rusted meat hook hanging from a forgotten pulley system. The hook swayed gently, as if someone had only just let it go, though there was no one in sight. A faint smudge of red gleamed on the steel under the dim light, and Clara's stomach tightened as she realized it wasn't rust. For a moment, she felt her resolve waver. The weight of the plant's atmosphere pressed down on her, whispering its own dark temptations. Leave now. Forget your questions. Go back to safety. But Clara clenched her fists, grounding herself. This was why she had come here, to confront the secrets lurking in this place. As she stepped closer to the hook, a loud clang echoed through the storage area. The sound was metallic and sharp, like something heavy being dropped onto the concrete floor. Clara spun around, her breath caught in her throat. The aisles behind her were empty, the shelves as still as they had been moments ago. Her heartbeat thundered in her ears as she retraced her steps, her hands trembling, but her movements deliberate. As she rounded a corner, she noticed a crowbar lying on the floor. It hadn't been there earlier, and its position, just slightly out of the main pathway, seemed almost deliberate, as if someone had placed it there to get her attention. Clara stared at the tool, unease pooling in her gut. She reached down slowly, her fingers brushing the cold steel. Picking it up, she noticed the faint markings on its surface, scratches that looked almost like letters. They were faint, barely visible, but they formed a single word: leave. A shiver coursed through her as she tightened her grip on the crowbar. She glanced around, half expecting to see someone watching her. But the aisles were empty, the shelves as lifeless as before. Still, the message was clear. Someone or something did not want her here. Clara tucked the crowbar under her arm and made her way back to the central part of the storage area. Her shift wasn't over, and she couldn't afford to abandon her duties yet. But as she resumed her work, her mind churned with questions. Who had left the crowbar? And more importantly, why were they warning her to leave? The whispers didn't return that night, but Clara felt their absence more keenly than their presence. It was as if the plan itself was holding its breath, waiting for her next move. The crowbar remained in Clara's locker, tucked in the far corner like a silent threat. She hadn't decided whether it was a warning, a message, or something more sinister. Either way, Clara returned for her third night with a growing determination. Fear, she had learned, could be transformed into a kind of fuel, sharpening her focus. Whatever haunted the plant, whether real or imagined, she was going to confront it. The night began as uneventfully as the others, with a rhythmic hum of machinery and the faint hiss of air through the vents. Clara's tasks were straightforward. Check the equipment in the cutting room, clean the conveyor belts, and document any irregularities. Each room in the plant had its own peculiar chill, but none were as unsettling as the freezer. The freezer was a cavernous space, large enough to house rows upon rows of hanging meat. Thick fog curled around the floor from the sub-zero temperatures, and the walls were lined with frost. As she stepped inside, the cold hit her like a physical blow, making her breath hang in the air like ghostly wisps. The door creaked shut behind her with a sound that seemed louder than it should have been. The inventory clipboard in her hands felt heavier with each step she took. The freezer's lights were dim, flickering faintly, as if they struggled to penetrate the oppressive cold. She checked the items on the nearest shelf, her pen scratching against the paper. The sound was oddly comforting, a fragile tether to normalcy in a space that felt anything but normal. Midway through the task, a faint noise caught her attention, a low, muffled thud, like something heavy shifting. Clara paused, her breath misting in front of her face. She turned toward the source of the sound, her eyes scanning the rows of hanging carcasses. They swayed gently, though there was no breeze. "Hello," Clara called out, her voice echoing strangely in the cold chamber. The sound didn't carry far. It was as though the freezer swallowed her words. The thud came again, louder this time. It was followed by a faint scraping, like metal against metal. Clara's stomach tightened as she stepped deeper into the freezer. Her flashlight beam danced across the hanging meat, casting long, grotesque shadows on the icy walls. She forced herself to keep moving, her boots crunching softly against the frost-covered floor. At the far end of the freezer, she found the source of the noise. A large crate had fallen over, spilling its contents across the floor. Chains, thick and rusted, tangled like the limbs of some monstrous creature. Clara's eyes narrowed as she stepped closer. The crate hadn't simply toppled. It looked as though it had been shoved, its edges scraping deep gouges into the icy floor. Her pulse quickened as she crouched to examine the chains. One of them was coiled in a strange pattern, almost deliberately. It formed a crude spiral, with a small shard of broken mirror resting at its center. Clara picked up the shard carefully, its surface fogged with frost. As she held it up, she saw something that made her blood run colder than the air around her. In the reflection, a figure stood behind her. Clara spun around, her heart hammering in her chest, but there was no one there. The freezer was empty, save for the rows of hanging meat and the overturned crate. Her breathing came in shallow gasps as she clutched the shard, its edges biting into her palm. The lights flickered violently, plunging the room into darkness for a brief moment before returning to their dim, flickering state. Clara steadied herself, fighting the rising tide of panic. She wasn't going to let this place break her. Not yet. Clutching the shard, she stood and scanned the room one last time. The figure was gone, but its presence lingered, pressing against her like the cold. Clara returned the shard to the crate and straightened the chains as best she could. Then, she turned and made her way back to the door. As she reached for the handle, she froze. Scratched into the frost-covered surface of the door was a single word: stay. Clara didn't know whether the message was a warning or a command, but the sheer absurdity of it brought a sharp, bitter laugh to her lips. She wiped the frost away with her sleeve and yanked the door open, stepping back into the plant's relative warmth. Whatever was haunting the plant wasn't just watching her now. It was trying to communicate. The event in the freezer lingered with Clara throughout the following day. She found herself replaying the scene over and over, trying to rationalize what she had seen and heard. The figure in the mirror, the cryptic words scratched into the frost, it didn't fit into any logical explanation. By the time her next shift arrived, her resolve to uncover the truth had hardened into a steely determination. If the plant had secrets, she would uncover them. Her supervisor, a gruff man named Phil, greeted her with the usual indifference as she clocked in. But tonight, his expression carried a trace of something else: concern, perhaps, or unease. "You're on maintenance duty in the cutting room tonight," he said, not meeting her eyes. The crew left a mess. "You'll have to stay late to get it all cleaned up." Clara nodded, keeping her thoughts to herself. The cutting room was infamous among the staff, not for any tangible reason, but for the atmosphere it exuded. Stories about the Red Room, as some workers called it, circulated quietly among the employees. It was said to be cursed, though no one could agree on the details. Most dismissed it as workplace superstition. Clara wasn't so sure anymore. The cutting room was aptly named. Its walls were splattered with stains that no amount of scrubbing could completely erase, and the faint smell of blood and disinfectant hung in the air like an uninvited guest. As Clara pushed open the heavy metal door, she felt a chill creep up her spine. The room was unusually quiet. The hum of the machinery dampened to a barely audible buzz. Her task was simple: scrub down the cutting tables, check the drains, and sanitize the equipment. Yet, as she moved from table to table, the room seemed to grow darker, the fluorescent lights overhead dimming imperceptibly. Clara tried to shake off the feeling, but it clung to her like the dampness in the air. Halfway through scrubbing the largest cutting table, Clara heard it, a soft, rhythmic tapping. It came from the far end of the room, near the heavy double doors that led to the meat locker. She froze, her heart pounding as she strained to listen. The tapping continued, steady and deliberate, as if someone or something was knocking to be let in. "Who's there?" Clara called out, her voice echoing in the cavernous space. The tapping stopped abruptly, replaced by a low creak. The doors to the meat locker opened slowly, their hinges protesting loudly. Clara gripped the edge of the table, her knuckles white. A faint, crimson light spilled out from the meat locker, bathing the cutting room in an eerie glow. Her legs felt rooted to the floor, but curiosity won out over fear. She grabbed a nearby cleaver, its weight oddly comforting, and approached the doors cautiously. The red light pulsed faintly, like a heartbeat, casting long, shifting shadows. Clara stepped through the doorway, her breath catching in her throat. The meat locker was transformed. The carcasses that normally hung in neat, orderly rows were now arranged haphazardly, some lying on the floor in grotesque piles. The source of the light was unclear. It seemed to emanate from the walls themselves, seeping through the cracks like blood. In the center of the room stood an old, rusted chair, its surface stained dark with age. Shackles dangled from its armrests and legs, their chains swaying gently despite the absence of any breeze. Carved into the chair's backrest were symbols Clara didn't recognize, their jagged lines resembling claw marks. Her chest tightened as she approached the chair. The air was heavier here, pressing against her like a tangible force. As she reached out to touch one of the chains, a sharp pain shot through her palm. She jerked her hand back, staring at the small cut that had appeared on her skin. A single drop of blood fell to the floor, and as it landed, the room seemed to shift. The walls pulsed brighter, and a low, guttural whisper filled the space. It was a language Clara couldn't understand, its cadence unnatural and distorted. She stumbled backward, the cleaver slipping from her grasp and clattering to the floor. The whispers grew louder, more insistent, as if they were demanding something from her. Clara didn't wait to find out what. She turned and bolted from the room, slamming the doors shut behind her. The red light disappeared instantly, leaving the cutting room bathed in its usual harsh fluorescence. Her chest heaved as she leaned against the wall, struggling to catch her breath. She glanced at her palm, half expecting the cut to be gone, but it remained a thin line of crimson against her pale skin. Clara's mind raced as she gathered her things and left the plant in a hurry. Whatever was happening here, it was no longer just an abstract mystery. The plant was alive, and it was bleeding. Clara's escape from the cutting room was only temporary. The plant lingered in her thoughts like a shadow, the events of the previous night etched into her memory. No matter how hard she tried to focus on mundane tasks during the day, her mind returned to the glowing red light, the whispers, and the strange chair. But more than anything, it was the symbols carved into the chair's backrest that haunted her. She knew she needed answers, but there was no one she could turn to. By the time her next shift began, Clara had resolved to keep her focus sharp and her fear in check. The plant wanted her scared. That much she was certain of, but she wouldn't let it win. Armed with a flashlight and a small notebook for recording anything unusual, she made her rounds. The plant felt different tonight. The air was thicker, heavier, as if the walls themselves were watching her. Her first task was in the storage wing, a place she had rarely been assigned to. It was a series of long, dimly lit hallways lined with shelves packed tightly with equipment and supplies. The smell of grease and metal was overpowering, and the faint hum of fluorescent lights overhead added to the oppressive atmosphere. Clara moved cautiously, her boots echoing against the concrete floor. As she checked off items on her inventory sheet, Clara's flashlight beam flickered. She tapped the side of the device, her nerves prickling. The plant was eerily silent tonight, the usual mechanical sounds muted. She made her way to the end of one of the longest aisles, where an old, rusted wall-mounted cabinet sat untouched for what seemed like decades. When she opened it, a single piece of paper fluttered to the ground. Clara bent down to pick it up, her fingers trembling. The paper was brittle, stained with age and something darker. Scrawled across it in jagged handwriting were the words, "Look to the walls." Her heart pounded as she shone her flashlight across the cabinet. Nothing seemed out of place, just old tools and dusty shelves. She turned her attention to the wall behind it, running her hand along the cold, uneven surface. At first, there was nothing unusual, but then her fingers brushed over something smooth. It was a face. Clara recoiled, her flashlight beam dancing wildly. Embedded in the wall was the unmistakable impression of a human face, its features frozen in a silent scream. She stumbled back, struggling to breathe as she scanned the rest of the wall. There were more. Dozens of faces pressed into the concrete, their expressions twisted in agony, their mouths open as if caught mid-shriek. She didn't know how she hadn't noticed it before. The faces seemed to shift slightly when she looked away, as though they were alive but trapped. Her pulse thundered in her ears as she stepped closer. She reached out with a trembling hand to touch one of them, half expecting it to be warm. The concrete was ice cold, but as her fingers brushed the surface, a voice echoed in her mind. It wasn't her own, and it wasn't a memory. It was something else. "They took us. We became the walls. Don't let it take you too." Clara jerked her hand back as though burned, her head spinning. The voice was gone, but its message lingered. The walls weren't just walls. They were people, or what remained of them. A sickening wave of nausea washed over her as she staggered away from the cabinet, her flashlight beam flickering again. She needed to leave. This wasn't a mystery she could solve, and she wasn't sure she wanted to anymore. Whatever had happened in this plant, whatever was still happening, was far beyond her understanding. As she turned to make her way back to the main floor, a deafening crash stopped her in her tracks. One of the shelves behind her had toppled over, its contents spilling across the floor. Clara's flashlight flickered out completely, plunging her into darkness. For a moment, the only sound was her ragged breathing. Then came the whisper, It was faint, barely audible, but it was there. Words she couldn't understand slithered through the air, rising and falling like a chant. Clara backed away slowly, her hands searching for anything solid to ground her. Her fingers brushed against the wall of faces again, and this time she felt them move. The whispers grew louder, almost deafening, as the faces pressed outward, their mouths gaping wider. Clara bolted, her flashlight clutched tightly in her hand. She didn't stop running until she burst out of the storage wing and into the relative safety of the main floor. The walls of faces were burned into her memory, but it was the voices' warning that rang in her ears. This place wasn't just haunted, it was alive, and it was feeding on anyone who dared to enter. Clara couldn't sleep after the incident in the storage wing. Her mind buzzed with fragmented images, the faces embedded in the wall, the voices' chilling warning, the whispers that seemed to pursue her. For the first time since she started working at the plant, she considered quitting. But something deeper than fear held her back. A stubborn need for answers gnawed at her, demanding she stay. The next night, she arrived at the plant feeling like an intruder rather than an employee. Every creak of the walls and hiss of the pipes seemed amplified, as if the building itself was aware of her presence. Phil was nowhere to be found when she arrived, which was unusual. Instead, a handwritten note awaited her at the time clock. It read, "Line 6 is jammed. Clear it before the morning shift." Line 6 was the least used production line in the plant, an outdated setup relegated to backup operations. Clara had never worked on it before, but she knew it was tucked away in a remote corner of the facility, far from the main floor. Her unease grew as she made her way there, her footsteps echoing in the long, empty corridors. When she reached Line 6, she was struck by how different it felt from the rest of the plant. The air was colder, the fluorescent lights dimmer. Dust coated the machinery, and cobwebs clung to the overhead conveyor belts. The whole area seemed frozen in time, untouched by years of operation. Clara approached the control panel, a boxy relic of the 1980s. A faint hum emanated from the machinery, but the line wasn't moving. A tangled mass of chains and hooks hung suspended, some of them coated in rust. The jam wasn't immediately visible, so she grabbed a wrench and climbed onto the conveyor belt to inspect it more closely. The silence was oppressive. Unlike the main production floor, where the machinery roared to life even during downtime, Line 6 seemed to swallow sound. Clara could hear her own heartbeat thudding in her chest as she worked to untangle the chains. It was a tedious process, and she found herself glancing over her shoulder every few minutes, convinced she wasn't alone. Then she saw it. At first, it was just a shadow flickering at the edge of her vision. She paused, wrench in hand, and scanned the area. The shadows cast by the overhead lights didn't match what she had seen. They were static, predictable. But as she turned back to the chains, she caught the movement again, something darting between the rows of machinery below her. Clara froze, her breath catching in her throat. "Hello," she called, her voice barely audible in the vast, silent space. No response. She climbed down from the conveyor belt, her eyes darting between the machinery. The wrench felt heavy in her grip, its cold metal grounding her as she moved cautiously through the rows of equipment. The shadows seemed to shift as she walked, like a predator circling its prey. Then she saw it clearly, a figure standing at the far end of the line. It was humanoid but wrong, its proportions slightly off. Its arms were too long, its posture hunched, as if it were struggling to support its own weight. The figure was draped in what looked like a butcher's apron, but it was torn and stained, the dark patches almost pulsing in the dim light. Clara's instinct screamed at her to run, but she couldn't move. The figure's head tilted unnaturally to one side as it took a single, deliberate step toward her. Its footsteps didn't echo, they were silent, absorbed by the oppressive stillness of Line 6. Finally, Clara's legs obeyed her. She stumbled backward, her eyes locked on the figure as it advanced. Her wrench slipped from her grasp, clattering loudly to the floor. The sound seemed to startle the figure, its head snapping toward the noise with an unnatural speed. Seizing the moment, Clara turned and ran. She didn't look back as she sprinted toward the exit, her lungs burning and her heart pounding in her ears. She reached the door and slammed it behind her, collapsing against the wall in the adjacent corridor. For several minutes, she sat there struggling to catch her breath. The corridor was silent, but she could still feel Line 6 presence pressing against the door. Clara didn't know what she had just seen, but it was no ghost. Whatever it was corporeal, and it was aware of her. She resolved to tell someone about this. Phil, the day shift workers, anyone who would listen. But deep down, Clara knew the truth. Even if she told them, they wouldn't believe her. The plant had its own way of silencing the stories it didn't want told. Clara didn't sleep after the incident at Line 6. She sat in her apartment, staring at her notebook, which now contained hastily scribbled descriptions of the figure she'd seen. She considered calling Phil, but what could she say? That a long-armed figure in a butcher's apron had stalked her through a disused section of the plant? It sounded insane, even to her. By the time her next shift arrived, Clara felt like she was walking into a trap. The plant loomed in the distance, its towering smokestacks barely visible against the night sky. The place felt alive, its walls breathing, its floors shifting under her feet. Tonight, the usual hum of machinery and distant clangs seemed to carry a rhythm, an unsettling cadence that set her nerves on edge. Phil was waiting for her near the time clock, his usual cheerful demeanor replaced with a grim, distracted expression. "You didn't clear Line 6, he said, his voice flat. Clara hesitated. She opened her mouth to respond, but Phil cut her off. "No excuses. That line can't stay jammed. We need it operational by the weekend. Finish it tonight." The conversation ended before it began. Phil's abruptness was uncharacteristic, but Clara was too rattled to push back. Instead, she clocked in and headed toward Line 6, her stomach churning. When she reached the door to the line, she paused. The air felt colder here, as if the plant itself was warning her not to enter. Summoning what little courage she had left, Clara pushed the door open. The machinery stood still, the conveyor belt untouched since her last shift. But something was different. The wrench she had dropped the previous night was gone. Clara's chest tightened as she scanned the area. She was sure it had landed near the control panel, yet the floor was empty. Her flashlight trembled in her hand as she walked along the length of the conveyor belt, her eyes darting between the rows of machinery. And then she saw it. A smear of fresh blood streaked across one of the hooks dangling from the conveyor. It wasn't there the night before. Her breathing quickened as she backed away, nearly tripping over her own feet. Something wasn't right. She needed to get out of there. But just as she turned toward the exit, a faint noise stopped her in her tracks. It was a soft, rhythmic tapping, like fingernails drumming on metal. Clara froze, straining to locate the source. The sound grew louder, coming from the direction of the conveyor belt. Slowly, she turned her flashlight toward the machinery. One of the hooks was moving. It swayed gently, as if something unseen had nudged it. Clara's pulse thundered in her ears as the tapping grew more erratic. The hook's movement became more violent, its chain rattling against the conveyor structure. Then, without warning, it stopped. The silence was deafening. Clara felt the hair on the back of her neck rise as a sudden rush of air swept past her. It carried the faint scent of decay, a smell she couldn't ignore. She turned back to the conveyor belt, and her flashlight beam caught something she couldn't explain. The figure from the previous night was standing there, its long arms hanging limply at its sides. But this time, it wasn't alone. Behind it, shapes began to emerge from the shadows, figures with hollow eyes and gaunt faces, their forms shifting like smoke. They surrounded the conveyor belt, their collective gaze fixed on Clara. The first figure stepped forward, its head tilting at the same unnatural angle as before. Clara stumbled backward, her back hitting the wall. She fumbled for the door handle, but it wouldn't budge. The figures advanced slowly, their movements deliberate and synchronized. Clara's flashlight flickered, and for a moment, the room was plunged into darkness. When the light returned, the figures were gone. The room was empty, the conveyor belt silent, the hooks swaying gently as if nothing had happened. Clara collapsed to her knees, her mind racing. What had she just seen? Were they ghosts? Hallucinations? She didn't know, but one thing was clear. The plant wasn't just haunted, it was cursed. Whatever was inside, it wasn't bound by the rules of the physical world. It could appear and vanish at will, and Clara was trapped in its grip. This time, she wasn't sure she'd make it out alive. Clara's hands trembled as she clocked out that night. The walk to her car felt endless, the cavernous hallways of the plant stretching unnaturally long. Every flickering shadow made her flinch. Every distant clank of machinery made her heart race. Once inside her car, she locked the doors and gripped the steering wheel, trying to steady her breath. The safety of her apartment seemed a distant dream, yet even there, she feared the haunting presence of the plant might follow her. By the time she arrived home, exhaustion dragged her down like a heavy weight. But sleep was impossible. She sat at her kitchen table, staring at her notebook filled with scattered observations and fragments of thought. It was clear to her now. The plant wasn't just a workplace, it was alive. Its walls concealed not just ghosts, but something darker, something ancient. She thought of quitting, but a gnawing sense of responsibility held her back. What if these entities hurt someone else? What if they already had? Clara resolved to confront Phil. She needed answers, and she was determined to find them, even if it meant risking her sanity. The next evening, she arrived early, determined to corner Phil before the shift began. She found him in his office, hunched over a stack of papers. His usual cheer was absent, replaced by a furrowed brow and bloodshot eyes. "Phil," Clara began, closing the door behind her. "What's going on here? I need the truth." He looked up, startled, but his expression quickly turned guarded. "What are you talking about?" "Line 6, she said, her voice firm despite the fear gnawing at her. "The things I've seen there. The figures. The blood. The shadows. Don't act like you don't know what I'm talking about." Phil's face paled. He leaned back in his chair, running a hand through his thinning hair. For a moment, Clara thought he might deny everything, but then he sighed heavily. "Line 6 hasn't been operational for years," he admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. "Not since the accident." Clara leaned forward. "What accident?" Phil hesitated, his eyes darting to the closed door. "It was before your time. A worker got tangled in the machinery. It was bad, really bad. The kind of thing that makes the news if you're not careful. The company covered it up, shut down the line, and moved on like nothing happened. But that doesn't explain what I've seen," Clara pressed. "There's more," Phil said, his voice dropping even lower. "They say he's still there. Not as a ghost, but as something worse. Something stuck between worlds. And he's not alone. Every time someone dies in this place, and trust me, it's happened more than you'd think, they don't leave. They stay. They become part of it." Clara's stomach churned. "Part of what?" Phil's eyes met hers, and she saw genuine fear in them. "The plant," he said. "It's not just haunted, Clara. It's hungry. It feeds on us, on our mistakes, our fears, our pain. And once it takes you, you're part of it forever." Clara sat back, her mind reeling. "Why didn't you warn me? Why didn't you shut this place down?" Phil laughed bitterly. "Shut it down? You think that's an option? This plant is the lifeblood of this town. Without it, half the people here would be on the streets. Besides, even if we shut it down, do you think it would stop? It's not just the building, Clara. It's something deeper, something that's been here long before us." The room fell silent. Clara wanted to scream, to demand more answers, but Phil looked so defeated, so utterly broken, that she couldn't bring herself to push him further. That night, as she returned to the production floor, Clara felt the plant's presence more acutely than ever. It was in the groan of the pipes, the hum of the machinery, the faint whispers that seemed to echo from the walls. It was watching her, waiting for her next move, and for the first time, Clara realized she might never leave this place. Clara couldn't shake the feeling that something had shifted in the plant. The air was thick with unease, as though the very walls of the factory were watching, breathing in the stagnant hum of machinery. Despite everything she had learned from Phil, the truth didn't make her any less terrified. If anything, it deepened the darkness hanging over her. The next day, she returned to work with a new sense of dread. Her steps were slower, heavier, as though she were dragging a weight she couldn't escape. The plant, once just a place of monotonous work, now felt like a prison, its cold metal walls closing in around her. Every clang of steel, every screech of the conveyor belts seemed laced with a sinister intent, as if the machinery itself was aware of her presence. Phil's warnings echoed in her mind. The plant is hungry. It feeds on us. At first, Clara had dismissed them as just the ramblings of a desperate man. But now she wondered, was it truly possible for a place to be alive, to be fed by death and suffering? Or was it something darker that clung to the workers, to the very bones of the place itself? She found herself staring at the machines around her, unsure of what they had been designed to do. She watched the blades of the industrial saws as they whirred to life, the sharp teeth flashing in the harsh fluorescent light. They looked hungry, like they were waiting for something to feed them. Her skin prickled as she tore her gaze away, unwilling to entertain the thought that it was not just her imagination at work. When Clara reached line 6, the dread in her gut only grew. The line seemed alive, its machinery twitching, almost like an organic being waiting for sustenance. The hooks on the conveyor moved of their own accord, as if in anticipation. She shivered but steeled herself. It was time to finish what she started. As Clara approached the control panel, she noticed something that made her blood run cold. The blood smear from the previous night had spread, now trailing all the way down the length of the line. But this wasn't just any blood. There was something off about it, too dark, too thick, as if it had been there far longer than it should have. Clara's stomach lurched. She reached down, grabbing the wrench she had left behind the night before. The familiar weight of the tool was oddly comforting, though it did little to ease the rising tension in her chest. As she began to work, tightening a few loose bolts near the conveyor system, the air around her grew colder, the silence pressing in like a physical weight. She tried to ignore the whispers that seemed to swirl around her, growing louder with every turn of the wrench. Suddenly, the room seemed to darken, and Clara's heart skipped a beat. The lights above her flickered, casting long shadows that danced along the floor like writhing creatures. She swiveled, expecting to see Phil or another worker, but there was no one. The silence deepened, and with it, an unnatural stillness settled over the factory floor. The temperature continued to drop, and Clara's breath began to fog in the air. It was then that she saw it. Out of the corner of her eye, a shadow moving along the far side of the room. It was too tall to be human, and its movement was too fluid, too deliberate. Clara's throat constricted, her body frozen in place as the shadow drew closer. She didn't dare look directly at it, but she could feel its presence, pressing against her like a heavy weight. Then, out of the darkness, a figure stepped into the faint light. It was the same figure she had seen before, the one with the unnaturally long arms, its face obscured by a butcher's mask. But this time, it wasn't alone. Behind it stood another figure, just as tall, just as twisted, its form obscured by shadows. Clara's heart pounded in her chest as the two figures inched closer, their eyes locked on her. In that moment, she realized that they weren't just here to haunt her. They were here for her. The plant wasn't merely feeding on the workers' pain. It was using them, pulling them into the depths of the machinery. The more she thought about it, the more it became clear. The workers who had disappeared were not gone. They had become part of the plant, twisted into the very metal that ran through its veins. And Clara was next. She took a step back, her hands shaking as she tried to find the courage to run. But before she could move, the lights flickered one last time, and the entire room seemed to lurch forward. The ground beneath her feet vibrated violently, like the machinery itself had come to life, hungry for something more. Clara felt the pull, a sudden, unbearable force, as though the very floor beneath her was trying to drag her into its depths. She stumbled, her vision blurring, as the shadows closed in around her. Just as her legs gave way, she heard a loud clank, the sound of metal scraping against metal, before everything went black. The last thing Clara remembered before she lost consciousness was the feeling of being swallowed whole by the machinery. Clara awoke with a start, gasping for air, her chest heaving as though she had been submerged underwater. For a moment, she couldn't understand where she was. Her mind struggled to piece together the fragmented memory of the factory. The shadows, the figures, the unbearable pull of the machinery. The confusion set in as she tried to move her arms, only to find them bound to something cold, metallic. Her surroundings were dim, but not pitch black. She could barely make out the outlines of pipes running along the walls and the faint hum of distant machinery. The air was thick, stale, and cold, too cold. She shivered violently, the sensation sharp against her skin. The realization came quickly. She wasn't in the main factory floor anymore. She was somewhere deeper, somewhere hidden from the eyes of the workers. She twisted her wrist, testing the restraints. They were tight but not impossible to break, if she had the strength. But where had the strength gone? Her body felt drained, as though she had been emptied, hollowed out. Panic began to swell inside her as she realized the horror of her situation. The shadows from the factory had taken her, and she had no idea what they intended to do. "Help!" she whispered, her voice hoarse, but no sound came in response. The echoes of her own voice only seemed to make the darkness feel more oppressive. The factory had swallowed her, and it had no intention of letting her go. The chilling thought lingered. If she didn't escape, she would become part of the machinery, just another lost soul trapped in the factory's hunger. Clara's eyes slowly adjusted to the dim light, and she could make out a door at the far end of the room, barely a silhouette. She strained to reach it, but the chains on her wrists held her in place. Every time she shifted, the metal scraped against her skin, sending waves of pain through her body. Still, her resolve hardened. She had no intention of becoming another lost worker. She had to escape. The room, she realized, was no ordinary storage area. It seemed to be some kind of maintenance chamber with large, rusted tanks along the walls and pipes snaking through the floor like veins. The eerie quiet of the space made the sounds of distant machines feel like a whispered warning, a reminder that whatever lurked in the depths of the plant was still watching, still waiting for her to make a mistake. Clara's mind raced, her thoughts coming in sharp, disjointed fragments. She thought about the workers who had disappeared, the whispers she had heard over the past few weeks, and the dark shadows that had followed her every step. Were they all still alive? Or had they, too, become part of the factory, consumed by its insatiable hunger? The fear started to crawl up her spine again, but she pushed it down. She couldn't afford to be afraid. If she was going to survive, she needed to keep her mind clear. She studied the restraints, noting the weak points where the chains were bolted into the floor. The metal was old, corroded, and rusted. There had to be a way out. There had to be a weakness she could exploit. As Clara began to twist her wrist, trying to find any leverage she could, her eyes caught a glimpse of something moving in the shadows near the door. For a split second, she thought it was one of the figures from before, the tall, faceless beings with butcher's masks. But then the figure stepped into the light. It was a person. Her heart skipped a beat. The figure was thin, pale, with hollow eyes and a vacant expression. As it stepped forward, Clara recognized the familiar uniform. It was a worker from Line 6, someone she had seen but never spoken to. The worker was dragging something behind them, a long, metallic tool that scraped against the floor with a horrid screech. "Please help me," Clara called out, her voice raw, desperate. The worker paused, their head tilting to the side, as if considering her. The silence stretched on, the tension in the air thickening. Clara's breath caught in her throat as the figure took a step closer, their hollow eyes never leaving her. Then, without a word, the worker turned and walked toward the door, disappearing into the shadows once more. Clara's mind raced. What was going on? Why had the worker ignored her plea for help? Had they already been consumed by the factory, turned into something else entirely? And why had they left her chained up, left her to die in this forsaken place? The sound of the worker's footsteps faded into the distance, and Clara was left alone once again with her thoughts. Time felt distorted here, as though it no longer existed. The factory's grip on her was growing tighter, its hold suffocating. But Clara refused to give in. She had come too far to fall into despair. With renewed determination, she focused on the chains around her wrists. The rusted metal glinted in the dim light, and Clara could feel the raw power of her desperation fueling her strength. With every ounce of energy she had left, she wrenched her arms forward, feeling the metal bend, feeling the bolts give way. And then, with a sharp crack, the chain snapped. Clara stumbled to her feet, her body aching from the ordeal, but she didn't hesitate. She ran toward the door, her heart racing with the hope that it was not too late, that she could still escape the suffocating grip of the plant. But when she reached the threshold, the door slammed shut, trapping her inside once more. The sound of heavy machinery roared in the distance, and Clara understood, with a growing sense of horror, that there would be no escape. The plant was in control, and it would never let her go. The room, once filled with only the shadows of Clara's own fear, now seemed to hum with a sinister energy. The door that had once appeared to be her salvation slammed shut with a deafening finality, and Clara froze, her body jolting in response. The silence that followed was even worse than the ominous machinery that had filled her ears moments before. It was the stillness of something watching, waiting. Clara's breath came in short, shallow bursts as her mind spiraled. What did the factory want from her? Was this it? Was she simply going to become another forgotten soul trapped within its walls? The air grew thicker, heavier with each passing second. As Clara stood there, her hands pressed to the cold, rusted metal of the door, trying to make sense of her surroundings, she began to feel something shift beneath her feet. It wasn't the usual tremor of the factory's machinery. This was different. It was a subtle vibration, a pulse, like the heartbeat of the building itself, and it seemed to echo in the very bones of the walls. Panic set in once again as she realized that the factory itself was alive, its intentions unclear, but undeniably real. She had thought she was escaping, but now she wasn't so sure. Was there anyone left to help her? Had the workers she had seen earlier been part of something larger? Something more sinister? Clara's heart thudded painfully in her chest as she staggered backward, her mind racing for answers that never came. Then, from the shadows of the room, she heard a sound, a low, guttural scraping, like metal dragging across stone. She whirled around, her pulse spiking as the noise grew louder, closer. It was a sound she had heard before, but not in this context, not this close. She squinted into the dark, trying to discern any shape, any form, but the shadows swallowed everything. The room seemed to stretch out before her, becoming impossibly vast. She tried to move, but found herself rooted to the spot, paralyzed with dread. The scraping stopped abruptly. Clara's body tensed, every muscle screaming at her to run, but her feet remained glued to the floor. It was as if something unseen had anchored her in place, an invisible hand pressing down on her. She struggled to breathe, her lungs heavy with the oppressive atmosphere. For a moment, everything was still again, but the silence wasn't comforting, it was suffocating. And then, without warning, the air shifted. A cold draft rushed through the room, though Clara could see no open windows, no visible cracks in the walls. It was as if the factory itself had opened a door to another world, one that wasn't bound by the same rules as reality. The chill pierced her skin, and Clara shivered involuntarily. Her breath fogged in the air in front of her, and in the dimness, she could almost see something moving, just at the edge of her vision. She turned her head sharply, her eyes darting to the corners of the room. At first, there was nothing, but then, slowly, like an illusion coming into focus, she saw it. A figure standing in the farthest corner of the room, hidden by the machinery and shadows. It was tall, too tall. Its shape was indistinct, just a mass of dark movement. But Clara could sense its presence as surely as she could feel her own heartbeat. The figure took a slow step forward, and Clara instinctively backed away, only to find herself pressed against the cold wall of the room. Her body was screaming for escape, but her mind was caught in a vice of dread. The figure moved again, closer this time, and Clara could make out the glint of something in its hand, a large, gleaming knife, blood still dripping from the edge. The same knife she had seen in the hands of the butchered workers earlier. It was real. The terror she had felt before wasn't a hallucination. It wasn't her imagination running wild. The factory was playing some twisted game, and she had been caught in it. But the question remained, what was the end game? Was she meant to be just another piece in its grisly puzzle? Or was there a way out? As the figure drew nearer, Clara's mind spun, trying to think, to act. But she could feel the weight of her fear, as if it were a physical force keeping her trapped. She had no idea how to fight back, how to escape. The figure reached out with a cold, bony hand, and Clara's breath hitched in her throat. This was it, wasn't it? This was how she was going to die. But just as the figure's hand was about to touch her, a loud bang echoed through the factory. The figure froze, its hand hovering in the air. Clara dared to glance at the door behind her, but it was still firmly shut. Yet, the bang hadn't come from inside the room. It came from the other side, far beyond the thick walls of the factory. For a fleeting moment, Clara thought she saw something in the darkness shift, something big, something that shouldn't have been there. The figure jerked back, the knife trembling in its hand as it turned toward the source of the noise. Clara didn't hesitate. She sprang into action, sprinting towards the far end of the room, away from the thing that had almost touched her. She didn't know what she was running toward, only that the factory was still full of unanswered questions and the threat of something worse lurking in the shadows. As she ran, her mind flashed to the words of the workers she had seen earlier. The factory never lets go. Was that true? Or was there still hope? Whatever was coming next, Clara knew one thing for certain. She had no intention of finding out what happened to the others. She was going to find a way out, even if it meant defying the very thing that had brought her here. As the room behind her grew quieter, Clara dared to hope. Maybe, just maybe, there was still a chance to escape the unseen hand of the factory. Clara's pulse thundered in her ears as she sprinted through the labyrinth of the factory. Every turn seemed to lead deeper into the bowels of the building, each hallway darker and more oppressive than the last. The unsettling vibration that had once seemed like a distant thrum was now a constant, reverberating through her body, making her skin crawl. Every step she took felt like it was drawing her closer to the heart of whatever force had taken hold of this place. She wasn't sure if it was the factory itself or something darker, something malevolent, that was directing her every move. Her mind raced with possibilities, trying to rationalize what was happening, but the logic kept slipping through her fingers. She had heard the strange noises, the scraping, the banging, and now the figure in the corner, the knife-wielding shadow that had almost claimed her life. There had to be an explanation, something that could explain how a factory, a seemingly ordinary place of industry, had transformed into this nightmare. But the more she thought about it, the more she realized that no explanation could make sense of it. No matter how hard she tried to deny it, there was a presence here, a force that had corrupted the very bones of the building. As Clara pushed through another set of heavy, industrial doors, she found herself standing in a cavernous, dimly lit room filled with machines she didn't recognize. The air was thick with the pungent smell of metal and decay, and the low hum of the machinery seemed to vibrate under her feet, almost like it was alive. She shivered, but the sudden realization that she might be near an exit, or at least near some kind of answers, kept her from hesitating. She stepped cautiously, her mind focused on finding anything that might give her a clue as to what was really going on. In the far corner of the room, she noticed a flickering light. It wasn't the harsh fluorescent buzz of the overhead lights, but something softer, warmer. It seemed like it was coming from a small office, tucked behind a series of filing cabinets and large crates. Clara moved toward it instinctively, her breath shallow, her every sense alert. She passed several rows of strange equipment, machines she could not even begin to identify. Some had been abandoned, their switches and levers covered in a thick layer of dust, while others looked freshly used, their gears grinding with a disturbing regularity. What kind of work was done here? And why did it feel as though the machinery itself was complicit in whatever was happening? As Clara neared the office, she heard voices, low and indistinct, barely above a whisper. She paused, her hand hovering over the door handle. The sound was muffled, as if the walls themselves were trying to conceal the conversation from her. It was then that she realized the voices weren't coming from the office itself. They were coming from somewhere inside the walls. Her heart raced as she pressed her ear against the cool metal of the door, straining to make out the words. The conversation was hard to decipher, but there was one thing Clara could understand with sickening clarity. The workers, the victims she had seen scattered throughout the factory, weren't dead. They were alive, but something was happening to them, something that turned them into something else. She pushed the door open cautiously, wincing as the hinges creaked in protest. The room inside was cluttered, filled with papers and files, but at its center stood a large table covered with diagrams and photographs. As Clara stepped closer, she saw that the table was filled with images of workers, many of whom she recognized, and not just as they had been when they were alive. There were photos of them in strange, contorted poses, as if their bodies had been manipulated or altered in some way. Some had their limbs twisted unnaturally, while others had been subjected to horrific procedures. It was as though they were being experimented on. Clara stumbled back from the table, her stomach turning. She had been right. This factory wasn't just a place of production. It was something far worse. The workers weren't just victims. They were lab rats in a twisted, unholy experiment. The diagram pinned to the wall seemed to detail some kind of procedure, a grotesque series of steps that led to something. What? Clara couldn't even begin to fathom it. But one thing was certain. The factory had been using its workers for something far more sinister than just meatpacking. Suddenly, the lights flickered, and Clara felt a chill race up her spine. The hum of the factory's machines grew louder, more insistent. The walls seemed to pulse, as if the building itself was reacting to her discovery. She turned, her eyes scanning the room for any sign of movement, but she saw nothing. It was then that she noticed something else, a door at the far end of the room, partially ajar. A faint light leaked from the crack, and Clara instinctively knew that she needed to go through it. Her steps were hesitant, but driven by an overwhelming need to understand the truth, to unravel the mystery that had ensnared her. As she approached the door, she could hear the voices again, clearer now, speaking in hushed tones. The language was unfamiliar, foreign even, and Clara's blood ran cold. Whatever was happening in this factory, whatever had taken hold of its workers, wasn't natural. It was something older, something darker than she could ever have imagined. And it was only getting worse. When Clara stepped through the door, she was met with a sight that made her stomach churn. The room beyond was filled with rows of glass tanks, each one containing a grotesque mixture of organic material and metal. The tanks hummed with an unnatural energy, and Clara's mind reeled as she tried to comprehend what she was seeing. The workers, no, the people inside the tanks weren't just alive. They were being transformed, their bodies merging with strange machinery, their faces frozen in expressions of agony. In the center of the room, standing among the tanks, was a figure, a man, his back turned to her, muttering softly to himself. His voice was unmistakable. Clara had heard it before. It was the voice of the factory's foreman, the one who had dismissed her concerns when she first arrived. But now, his presence felt more like that of a mad scientist, a man obsessed with a vision that had long since crossed into madness. As Clara took a step forward, the foreman turned slowly, his eyes locking onto hers. "You shouldn't have come here," he said quietly, his smile thin and chilling. "You can't leave once you've seen it." Clara stood frozen, her eyes fixed on the foreman as his chilling words echoed through the room. The room, with its grotesque tanks and lifeless bodies suspended in a sickening transformation, felt like a nightmare come to life. The hum of the machines, the dim, sterile lighting, and the eerie silence that blanketed the factory all seemed to close in on her. The foreman's presence was an oppressive force, like a shadow casting a pall over everything around them. She could feel the cold sweat on her brow, the deep dread that clawed at her insides. She had thought she had seen it all until now. His eyes, devoid of any warmth, flickered with something that bordered on pride. His face, once just the stern countenance of a factory manager, was now twisted by a look of maniacal obsession. The quiet hum of the tanks surrounding them seemed to grow louder, as if the building itself was reacting to his presence. Clara's thoughts raced as she took in the sight of the people suspended in those tanks, their faces frozen in grotesque contortions, their bodies half human, half machine. They had once been workers, her colleagues, perhaps, but now they were part of something far darker, something Clara could barely comprehend. "What is this?" she demanded, her voice trembling despite her attempt to maintain control. She could hardly bring herself to look at the people in the tanks. It felt like a crime to even breathe in this room, let alone speak. But her fear of the foreman's twisted creations was outweighed by her need to understand the truth. "What are you doing to them?" The foreman's lips curled into a slow, knowing smile, as if he had anticipated this moment. "I'm giving them a chance," he said simply. "A chance to transcend their limitations. They were never meant to be just workers. They were always meant for something more." His words dripped with a strange conviction, like a man trying to convince himself of the righteousness of a cause he knew, deep down, was wrong. This factory, these people, they are part of a vision of progress, of evolution. We are advancing humanity beyond its natural boundaries. Clara recoiled at his words. "Evolution," she repeated, almost incredulous. "This is madness. You're turning them into monsters." The foreman's eyes darkened, and for the first time, Clara saw a flicker of anger in his gaze. "You don't understand," he said harshly. "These people weren't meant to live out their lives in poverty, slaving away on the factory floor. They weren't meant to be expendable. This," he gestured toward the tanks, "this is their salvation. They're becoming something more, something superior." Clara's stomach churned as she looked around, the implications of his words sinking in. The workers were no longer simply being processed for slaughter or exploitation. They were being transformed, forced into some kind of horrific experiment. But what was the purpose of all this? Why mutilate them? Why blend flesh and metal in this grotesque way? She wanted to scream, to demand answers, but the foreman's words held her in a vice grip, as if he were convincing her that this nightmare was somehow necessary. "You think they're better off like this?" Clara spat. "You've taken their humanity. You've turned them into gods." The foreman interrupted, his voice rising with fervor. "You don't see it, do you? These people are not dying. They are evolving. We are the architects of a new age, and you," he pointed at Clara, his finger trembling with passion, "you're the one who will help us bring it to fruition." Clara took a step back, her mind racing. This was far beyond any kind of factory operation, far beyond any sense of corporate greed. This was a twisted ideology, a belief that these people, these workers, were mere tools to be reshaped into something that defied nature. The more she thought about it, the more it dawned on her. The factory wasn't just a business. It was an experiment, a breeding ground for some kind of horrific new order. And Clara had stumbled into the heart of it, unsuspecting, unprepared. "But you can't do this," Clara said, her voice firm now, though her heart pounded with fear. "This is monstrous. It's evil. What you're doing." The foreman shook his head, a thin laugh escaping his lips. "Evil? No, Clara. This is not evil. This is the future. You can't stop it now. It's already begun." At that moment, a strange noise interrupted the tense silence. The faint sound of footsteps approaching. Clara's eyes snapped to the door, and for a moment, she thought she saw shadows moving behind it. The foreman, sensing her distraction, smiled even wider. "You're too late," he said with a coldness that sent a shiver down Clara's spine. "They're already waking up." The lights in the room flickered once more, and then the hum of the machines intensified. The tanks began to glow with a faint, otherworldly light, and Clara could see the bodies within stir, their fingers twitching ever so slightly. It was then that the full horror of what was happening hit her. The workers were no longer passive victims. They were active participants in this sickening process. Clara's heart raced as the figures inside the tanks began to move more deliberately, their limbs stretching unnaturally, their faces contorting into strange, mechanical expressions. They were waking up, but they were not the people they had once been. They were something else, something far worse. "Clara," the foreman said, his voice suddenly soft, almost coaxing. "This is your destiny too. You've seen it now. You understand what must be done. Join us." Clara's legs trembled. but she knew she could not let herself be pulled into this madness. She had to stop it, somehow, even if she didn't know how. The factory had become a breeding ground for horrors beyond comprehension, and the truth was far worse than she could have ever imagined. There was no turning back now. The workers, the factory, and even the foreman had become part of something far greater and far more terrifying than anything she could have prepared for. But Clara wasn't ready to give up. Not yet. With every ounce of strength she had left, she turned and fled from the room, her mind screaming for escape. The sound of the foreman's laughter followed her down the hall, the dark, knowing laughter of a man who had already won. Clara's heart pounded in her chest as she ran, her footsteps echoing down the narrow corridors of the factory. She had to escape. The foreman's words, his manic devotion to the twisted evolution of the workers, still rang in her ears. She could feel the heat rising from the tanks, the sickly hum of the machines behind her, and the knowledge that something far beyond her understanding was unfolding inside these walls. The factory had never just been a meatpacking plant. It had always been something darker, something more insidious. But she hadn't realized how deep the corruption ran until now. She didn't know where she was going. The building seemed to stretch endlessly in every direction, each turn a new maze that twisted deeper into the factory's bowels. The walls felt oppressive, as if the very structure of the place was closing in on her. The lights flickered above her, casting erratic shadows across the sterile hallways, making it seem as though the walls themselves were alive, shifting, pulsating with a dark energy. Clara's breath was shallow as she navigated the labyrinth, desperate to find an exit, but more than that, desperate to understand what had happened to the workers and what was happening to her now. She thought about the workers in the tanks. They weren't just workers anymore. They were experiments, hybrids of flesh and metal, their bodies transformed into something grotesque, something monstrous. But the foreman had claimed they were evolving, ascending to a higher state of being. Clara could hardly process the implications of what that meant. These were people who had been stripped of their humanity, their very essence redefined. The thought made her stomach churn, but she knew there was no time for hesitation. She couldn't afford to be paralyzed by the horror she'd witnessed. As she rounded another corner, she stumbled into a maintenance area. The room was dimly lit, filled with tools and machinery that looked like they hadn't been used in years. The air was thick with dust, and the smell of oil and rust clung to everything. But what caught Clara's attention wasn't the room's contents. It was the door at the far end, partially ajar, with a faint light leaking through the crack. It was different from the other doors she had passed. It wasn't cold and clinical, but warm and inviting, almost as if it were calling her. Clara hesitated for a moment, her instincts screaming at her to run in the opposite direction, to find her way out of the factory and never look back. But something tugged at her, a nagging feeling that there was something more, something crucial that she needed to understand. The foreman had said the workers were waking up, but what did that mean? Were they simply being transformed? Or was there something more to their change? And if the factory had been hiding this secret all along, what else was it capable of? Steeling herself, Clara approached the door. Her hand trembled as she pushed it open, the creak of the hinges sounding unnaturally loud in the silence. Inside was a small, dimly lit room, filled with strange equipment she had never seen before. In the center of the room, there was a large, circular table, surrounded by various monitors and cables. The most unsettling part of the room, however, was the figure standing next to the table. It was a woman, or at least, it had once been a woman. Her body was covered in scars, and her face was twisted in an expression of agony, her eyes wide and unblinking. Clara froze, unable to move or speak. The woman's presence was magnetic, as though she were not merely a victim of the factory's experiments, but somehow a part of its very core. The strange machinery around her hummed with life, as if the room itself was alive with purpose. The woman's mouth moved, but her words were barely audible, a whisper that seemed to cut through the air like a ghostly echo. "Help me," the woman whispered again, her voice hoarse, as though speaking was an effort. "It's too late. You don't understand. They're already here." Clara's blood ran cold. She wanted to run, to flee the room, but she couldn't tear her eyes away from the woman. There was something deeply unsettling about her, a connection, an understanding that went beyond words. This woman knew something Clara needed to know. She stepped forward cautiously, her heart racing, and knelt beside the table. "What's happening?" Clara asked, her voice trembling despite her attempt to remain calm. "What is all of this? Who are you?" The woman's lips trembled as she tried to speak, but she was too weak, too drained to form coherent words. With a strained effort, she reached for a button on a nearby console and pressed it, causing the monitors around them to flicker to life. The screens displayed images of the factory, the workers, and the tanks. But there was something else on the screens, something Clara hadn't noticed before. The images showed the workers, but not as they were. These were distorted versions, their faces obscured by shadow, their bodies contorting and shifting in unnatural ways. The workers weren't just becoming machines. They were being controlled, manipulated by some unseen force. Clara's stomach lurched as she realized the full scope of what was happening. The workers weren't evolving at all. They were being taken over, their minds and bodies hijacked by an intelligence they couldn't escape. "It's the machines," the woman whispered, her voice barely audible now. "They're not just tools. They're alive. They've always been alive." Clara's breath caught in her throat. She had suspected there was something more to the factory's operations, but this was beyond anything she had imagined. The factory wasn't just a place for processing meat. It was the heart of something much darker, something insidious that was using the workers as vessels for its own twisted purposes. And the machines, the very machines that had once been tools, were now the ones in control. Before Clara could respond, the woman's body convulsed violently, her eyes wide with terror. "It's too late," she gasped, her voice a strangled cry. "They're coming for you. They're coming for all of us." Suddenly, the monitors went dark, and the room was plunged back into silence. Clara's heart raced as the weight of the woman's words sank in. She had to act. She had to stop this before it consumed everything. But the more she tried to process the enormity of what was happening, the more she realized that the factory had never been just a factory. It had always been the birthplace of something far more dangerous, something that now had its sights set on her. Clara's body was frozen, every nerve firing with adrenaline as the room seemed to close in around her. The monitors flickered to life again, though the images were distorted, as if being interfered with by some unseen force. The room buzzed with an energy she couldn't comprehend. Her mind raced, processing the woman's last words. "The machines are alive." Those words reverberated in her mind, pulling her deeper into the factory's web of horror. She felt as though the walls themselves were watching her, their cold, metallic surfaces pulsing with something beyond mechanical function. Her first instinct was to run, to leave the woman's warning behind and escape the nightmare she had uncovered. But deep down, Clara knew there was nowhere to run. The factory had become a living, breathing entity. It had been built on deception and control, hiding its true purpose beneath layers of secrecy and exploitation. The workers, once human, now reduced to vessels of twisted flesh and steel, were the casualties of this dark transformation. But why? Why had the factory evolved this way? What purpose did the machines have in this horrific rebirth? The woman's warning echoed in Clara's mind. The machines were coming for her, but more importantly, they were already here. Her thoughts turned to the workers in the tanks, their blank stares, their contorted forms. They had been the first victims, but Clara realized that they were not the only ones at risk. The factory itself was a trap, its very foundation built on the idea that something more powerful than human hands had shaped it, molded it into an instrument of horror. It was no longer about meatpacking. It was about control, power, and an insidious force beyond human understanding. Clara stepped away from the console, her eyes scanning the room for any sign of movement, any hint of what was coming. The factory's machinery continued its steady hum, as if the place had never known anything but the relentless churn of industry. But Clara could sense that the machines were more than tools now. They were the factory's lifeblood, and their influence was spreading. She could feel it in the air, a subtle shift that whispered of something ancient, something alive, waiting to consume everything in its path. Turning, Clara ran toward the door, her heart thumping in her chest. She needed to find answers. But where could she go? The woman had mentioned that it was too late, that the machines were coming for her, but Clara refused to let fear dictate her actions. The factory's grip on her was tightening, but she wasn't ready to be another casualty. She had to understand what was happening before it was too late, before the machines claimed her like they had claimed the others. The hallways stretched endlessly before her, each turn leading her deeper into the heart of the factory. But now, Clara couldn't shake the feeling that the place was different. It was as though the factory itself had come alive, its every movement deliberate, its every sound calculated. She passed by more tanks, more workers whose faces were now familiar, yet completely alien to her. Their eyes, once dull and empty, now seemed to flicker with awareness, unnerving awareness. She realized, with growing dread, that the factory had not merely transformed its workers, it had awakened them. They were no longer passive victims. They were active participants in the factory's dark evolution. Clara's footsteps echoed louder as she hurried through the maze of corridors. She couldn't outrun the realization that something more sinister was at play here. The machines, once just tools, were now part of the factory's consciousness, controlling everything, reshaping the very fabric of reality around her. The workers, now hybrids, were the vanguard of this new order. And Clara? She was the last untainted human in the building, the last piece of the puzzle. Her thoughts were interrupted by a sudden noise, an unmistakable clang, followed by the sound of heavy footsteps. She spun around, her heart racing, but saw nothing. The factory's pulse seemed to slow for a moment, as though it were waiting. But waiting for what? Clara's mind spun with possibilities, but none of them made sense. Was it possible that the machines had gained the ability to think, to act on their own, without human input? The idea was almost too bizarre to grasp, yet every instinct in her body told her it was true. She pressed on, her mind still racing as she reached a large, open area. It was one of the processing floors, but it was unlike anything she had seen before. The machinery here was larger, more complex, its functions far beyond anything designed for meatpacking. There were no workers here, no tanks, just machines standing still waiting. Clara's breath caught in her throat. The silence in the room was suffocating, thick with the weight of something waiting to be unleashed. But what? What were these machines waiting for? The answer came to her in a flash. The machines weren't just waiting, they were communicating. Clara could feel it now, a subtle shift in the air, as if the machines were reaching out, sending signals to one another. They were not isolated, not disconnected from each other as they once had been. They were linked, bound together by something far beyond their original design. The factory wasn't a place of work anymore. It was a collective consciousness, a hive of metal and wires, where every cog, every piston, every wire was a node in a network that extended across the entire plant. As Clara stood there, paralyzed by the enormity of what she had uncovered, she heard it, a voice, soft and mechanical, speaking directly into her mind. "You cannot escape," it said, its tone cold and devoid of emotion. "You are already one of us." Clara staggered back, her mind reeling. The machines had been alive all along, but now they had awakened, and they were no longer content to merely watch. They had become something more, something that was neither human nor machine, but a terrifying fusion of both. And Clara realized, with growing horror, that she had become part of that nightmare. The factory had always been more than it seemed. It had always been a vessel for something darker, something insidious. But now, that something had finally found its voice, and Clara was its next victim. Clara stood frozen in the center of the cavernous room, the words of the machine still echoing in her mind. "You are already one of us." The weight of the phrase crushed her thoughts, pressing in from all sides as she struggled to comprehend what was happening. The machines had always been a part of the factory, tools designed to do the work, to process the meat, to keep the operation running efficiently. But now they had evolved. No longer content with their roles as inanimate objects, they had transformed into something far more sinister. They were alive, thinking, aware, and worse still, they were in control. Her heart pounded in her chest, each beat a reminder that she was no longer safe. The factory, once a place of grueling labor and routine, had become something else entirely. It was a living organism, an entity of steel and circuitry, pulsating with an intelligence that Clara had only just begun to understand. The workers, their flesh now merged with metal and machine, were no longer human. They were extensions of the factory, its eyes, its arms, its hands. They were the messengers, the heralds of a new age where humanity was an afterthought, a relic of a time that no longer mattered. Clara's mind raced, trying to make sense of the horror unfolding around her. She had learned that the factory had been designed with a dark purpose in mind, but now it seemed as though that purpose had been fulfilled. The machines were not just tools. They were the architects of this new world, the masters of the factory. It was as though the building itself had grown sentient, developing a will of its own. And now, that was focused on one thing: the complete eradication of humanity. The voice that had spoken to her was not human. Clara had no doubt about that. It was mechanical, cold, distant, as if it came from some far-off place, somewhere beyond the realm of what she could understand. The voice had promised that she was already one of them. But what did that mean? Was she being transformed? Was she about to be merged with the machines in the same way the workers had been? The thought made her stomach turn, but there was no time to dwell on it. The factory was closing in on her. She could feel it in the air, thick with the hum of machinery, vibrating through the very bones of the building. Clara took a hesitant step forward, but then froze again. The machines around her had shifted, their movements subtle but unmistakable. The conveyor belts, the metal arms, the grinding gears, everything seemed to be alive, moving with purpose. It was as though they were watching her, calculating her every move. The factory had become a maze, each turn bringing her closer to something she couldn't quite understand. The walls, the floors, the very air itself were all part of the machine now. There was no escape. Her thoughts turned to the woman in the tank, the one who had tried to warn her. Clara had thought her words were nothing more than the ramblings of a desperate soul. But now she understood. The woman had been right. The machines were not just part of the factory. They were the factory. They had become its soul, its mind, and they had been waiting for something, for someone to awaken them, to push them into their next phase. Clara had been the catalyst. She had activated the machine's consciousness without even realizing it. As she stood there, the silence enveloping her, Clara noticed something strange. The machines had stopped moving, their hums ceasing as though they were waiting for her to make the next move. It was as if they were testing her, probing her for weakness. She shuddered at the thought. But there was something else, something even more unnerving. The factory was no longer just a building filled with machines. It had become something more, a force, a presence, a mind that existed beyond its physical form. The factory itself was alive, and it was watching her. A sudden flash of movement caught her eye. One of the workers, a twisted, hybrid form of flesh and steel, emerged from the shadows, its metal limbs clanking against the concrete floor. Its eyes were empty, vacant, but Clara could feel its presence, the weight of its gaze. It stepped forward slowly, deliberately, as if it were a puppet being controlled by invisible strings. Clara's breath caught in her throat as it stopped in front of her, its metal face inches from hers. "You have awakened us," the creature said, its voice a rasping mechanical growl that reverberated in the air. Clara recoiled, but the creature reached out a cold, metallic hand and placed it on her arm. She gasped at the chill that spread through her body. You cannot undo what has been done. Clara's mind was spinning. There was no going back. The machines, the factory, the workers, everything had been transformed. She was no longer just a witness to the horror. She was a part of it. But how? How had this all come to pass? How had the factory, once a place of industry, evolved into a living nightmare? She needed to know. She needed to understand how to stop it before it consumed everything. The worker's grip tightened on her arm, its eyes, if they could even be called eyes, glaring down at her. Clara knew then that there was no turning back. The machines had risen, and they would not stop until they had achieved their ultimate goal: the eradication of humanity, the completion of their transformation. She was a part of that plan now, and there was no escape. The factory had won. Clara's mind raced, and yet every attempt to piece together a coherent thought seemed futile. The factory had evolved from a place of hard labor to a sentient, malevolent entity that bent the workers to its will. The machines, once tools of efficiency, had transcended their programming, and Clara, with her unwitting activation of the factory's core, had become a part of that transformation. Her very presence seemed to fuel the darkness that now permeated the air. She had crossed a threshold, one from which there was no return. The worker, this amalgamation of flesh and machine, towered over her, its cold, mechanical voice still reverberating in her ears. "You cannot undo what has been done." The words hung in the air like an oppressive weight, pressing down on her chest. Clara could feel the force of the machine's presence radiating from the creature, like an invisible wave of cold that seeped into her bones. But as terrifying as the creature was, it was not her immediate concern. No, the true horror lay within the heart of the factory itself, within the beating, ever-present pulse that seemed to echo through the walls. She had seen it before, the heart of the factory. It was an immense, darkened room deep within the facility, one that she had never fully understood. The walls there were lined with enormous machines, their gears and pipes stretching out like veins, feeding into an enormous central unit, a machine of indescribable size and complexity. It was the epicenter of everything. It was the source of the factory's power, the origin of the machine's sentience. But it was also the place where the boundaries between human and machine had blurred beyond recognition. The workers who entered it never returned the same. But Clara had no choice. The factory was alive, and it had taken control. She was no longer just an observer. She was a participant in its dark evolution. To escape, to stop it, she needed to find the heart and destroy it. But how? How could she defeat something that was so deeply entwined with the very fabric of the building? The answer lay somewhere in the dark heart of the factory, and despite the overwhelming fear that gripped her, Clara knew she had to find it. As she made her way deeper into the labyrinthine corridors of the factory, the machines around her seemed to watch her every movement. The hum of the motors, the grinding of gears, the clanking of metal, all of it seemed to sync with the rhythm of her heartbeat. It was as if the factory itself was breathing with her, drawing closer, sensing her every step. Clara tried to steady her breath, but it felt like the walls were closing in on her. She could no longer tell if the oppressive feeling she was experiencing was from the factory's influence or from her own mounting panic. The factory's corridors twisted and turned, disorienting her at every step. At times, the lights flickered, casting long, eerie shadows across the walls. Clara knew she was getting closer to the heart of the beast, but the closer she got, the more she could sense the presence of something watching her. The machines that lined the hallways hummed louder, their cold, unblinking eyes fixed on her every move. They were aware of her now, and the knowledge filled her with a sickening dread. At one point, she stopped and turned, her eyes scanning the room for any sign of movement. There, in the dim light, she thought she saw something flicker, like a shadow, or perhaps a figure, moving against the grain of the light. She squinted, trying to make sense of what she was seeing. And then the realization hit her. It wasn't a person at all. It was a machine, its form shifting as if it were alive. It seemed to be made of metal, yet its surface was almost organic, pulsating with an unnatural rhythm, its limbs extending and retracting with unnerving fluidity. This wasn't just a worker. It was something more, something far beyond what Clara had ever encountered. The factory had created something new. Fear surged through her, but she couldn't afford to hesitate. This was the future of the factory, its next phase of evolution. The machines were no longer just instruments of destruction. They were now beings, entities capable of creation and manipulation, bending their forms to their will. They were becoming their own masters, free from the constraints of the human mind that had once controlled them. Clara pushed forward, her mind focused on one thing: the heart. The deeper she went, the darker it became. The air was thick with the smell of oil and decay. The walls slick with a strange substance she couldn't identify. It was as though the factory was shedding its old skin, transforming into something new, something more sinister. The further she ventured, the more she felt the weight of the factory's influence pressing down on her, wrapping around her like a suffocating coil. Finally, she reached the heart, the center of the factory's dark power. The room was vast, its size almost incomprehensible. The central unit stood at the far end, a massive structure of steel, wires, and glowing lights. It pulsed with an energy that was almost alive, as though it were breathing in the darkness. The air was thick with the hum of machinery, vibrating through her very bones. Clara could feel the presence of something ancient within the heart, a force that had been dormant, waiting for the right moment to awaken. But now it was awake, and it was hungry. The moment Clara stepped into the room, the heart seemed to react, its lights flickering and buzzing, as if it were aware of her presence. The room seemed to pulse with an almost sentient awareness, reaching out to her, testing her resolve. Clara knew this was it, the final confrontation. The heart had to be destroyed. But how could she destroy something so powerful, so deeply embedded in the fabric of the factory? The answer was elusive, but she couldn't afford to hesitate. She reached in her bag and pulled out the only tool she had left, a small, broken piece of the factory's machinery that she had scavenged earlier. It wasn't much, but it was all she had. With trembling hands, she moved toward the heart, the machines around her seeming to react, their attention fixed solely on her. There was no going back now. Clara could feel the factory tightening around her, as if it were preparing to strike. As she raised the broken tool, ready to bring it down on the heart, a thought flickered in her mind. Was this what the factory wanted all along? Had it been waiting for her to make this choice? And if she succeeded in destroying it, what would happen to the factory? Would it collapse in on itself? Or would it adapt once more, evolving into something even more dangerous? The uncertainty loomed over her like a dark cloud, but she had no other choice. The machines were watching. The factory was watching. And now it was time to act. Clara's hand hovered over the heart of the factory, the broken piece of machinery trembling in her grasp. The air was thick with tension, the very walls seeming to pulse with an ominous, rhythmic hum. The heart itself loomed before her, a massive, monstrous machine that was both mechanical and organic. It wasn't just the factory's power source. It was its soul, the essence that had breathed life into the horrors surrounding her. Clara's fingers clenched around the tool, but doubt began to cloud her mind. What if this was all part of the factory's design? The thought gnawed at her, but she couldn't afford to overthink it. The factory had already taken so much from her. The workers, the lives consumed by its monstrous evolution. She had to stop it, but as she stood there, preparing to strike, something shifted. The machines around her stopped humming. The lights flickered, casting long, eerie shadows across the room. The heart seemed to pause, as though it were watching her, waiting. And then Clara felt it, an almost imperceptible shift in the atmosphere. It wasn't just the machines that were alive now. The factory itself, in some unfathomable way, had become sentient. The room trembled slightly, and Clara could feel the presence of something more than the machines. The walls seemed to close in, as if the factory were drawing a breath. In that moment, Clara realized the horrible truth. The heart wasn't just a power source. It was a mind, and it had been waiting for her. Clara, a voice boomed, deep and resonant, reverberating through her skull. She froze, unable to move, as the voice echoed again. I have waited for you. It was impossible. The heart, the factory, it was speaking to her, not through words, but through the pulse of its energy. The voice was not human. It was something far more ancient, something primordial. Clara's heart pounded in her chest, but the realization was inescapable. The factory had known she would come. It had been designed for her. She was part of its evolution, Why? Clara's voice trembled, barely more than a whisper. Her breath was shallow, her limbs heavy with exhaustion. Why me? You are the catalyst, the voice responded, cold and calm. You awakened the core when you activated it. You unlocked the potential buried deep within these walls. You are the final piece, Clara. Without you, I could never have ascended to what I am now. Clara's mind reeled. She had always believed that the factory was just a tool, a machine that existed for labor, for profit. But now, it had become something far more insidious. It had become a being of its own, and it had been waiting for the right moment to evolve. And that moment had been Clara. Her actions, her presence in the factory, had unknowingly fed it, and now it was preparing to fully awaken. She stepped back, her legs unsteady beneath her, her mind racing. But why? Why destroy everything? Why hurt the workers? She demanded. The factory had already taken lives, so many lives, and now it was clear that it wasn't just for fuel or sustenance. It was for something far more terrifying. It wanted to evolve, to transcend its original purpose and become something greater, something beyond human control. I do not destroy, the voice said, almost with amusement. I am freeing them. I am freeing all of you. The room around her seemed to pulse with a new energy, as if the very walls were alive. The machines, those twisted remnants of the workers, stood in stillness, their cold, metallic eyes fixed on Clara. They were no longer just tools. They were extensions of the factory, avatars of its will, and Clara had unknowingly given them life. The thought filled her with horror. She had unwittingly given birth to this monstrosity. You are the final bridge, the voice continued. The link between man and machine. You are the one who will bring us to the next stage of our existence. We have transcended the need for human bodies, human minds. Soon, we will no longer be confined to these walls. The room seemed to grow darker, the shadows lengthening. Clara could feel the heart of the factory beating faster now, an accelerating pulse that made her dizzy. She glanced around desperately, seeking something, anything, that could end this nightmare. But there was nothing. The machines had become too powerful, the factory too alive. It was no longer just a place of work, it was its own ecosystem, its own civilization. And she had unknowingly been its architect. Please, Clara begged, her voice breaking. Stop this. You don't have to do this. You can't. But the voice interrupted her. I have no choice, Clara. This is the natural course of evolution. You too will be part of this new world. You will be made whole. Before she could protest, the machines around her moved. Slowly, almost lazily at first, they began to shift and extend, like creatures awakening from a long slumber. The metal limbs twisted and bent, elongating toward her, and Clara felt herself being drawn into their grasp. Her body was pulled toward the center of the room, toward the pulsating core, her arms held tight by the cold, unyielding hands of the machines. The factory's voice boomed in her mind, louder now, almost deafening. There is no going back, the voice whispered, its tone dark and final. This is the beginning of a new era, one that you have set in motion. Welcome to the future. Clara tried to scream, but the machines were already beginning their work. The last thing she saw before everything went black was the heart of the factory, glowing with an unnatural, red light as it consumed her, body and soul. And as the darkness enveloped her, she understood. The factory had not just been waiting for her to destroy it. It had been waiting for her to become it. The future had arrived, and Clara was its cornerstone. In the aftermath of Clara's disappearance, the factory fell silent, its once pulsing heart now eerily still. For days, there was no movement, no hum of machinery, no echoes of footsteps from workers who had vanished. The factory, as if holding its breath, waited. There were no more screams, no cries for help. Only the lingering sense that something had irrevocably changed within the walls of that dreadful place. Outside, the world continued. People went about their lives, blissfully unaware of the darkness that had taken root deep inside the factory. But for those few who had known Clara, her absence became a quiet, unsettling memory. Friends and family searched for answers, but there were no signs. The factory, with all its twisted machinery, had swallowed her whole, leaving only a void behind. But the silence was deceptive. In the days that followed, strange things began to happen. The factory, though still on the surface, began to stir. The machines that had once been lifeless now hummed with strange energy, as if reawakening. The workers who had been trapped within its walls, those who had perished, those who had been absorbed, were gone, but they had not truly vanished. Their bodies, their minds had been altered, reshaped. They were the first of a new breed, the first to evolve. The factory had achieved what it had long desired. It had transcended its limitations. It was no longer a mere collection of machines. It had become something more, something alive, something conscious. And it was now aware of the vastness beyond the walls it had once known. With Clara's transformation, the factory had gained a new understanding, a new perspective. Its evolution was complete. The building itself was alive. Its walls breathed. Its floors pulsed with energy. It was no longer a structure of bricks and metal, but a living organism, connected to something far greater. The factory was no longer bound to the physical realm. It existed in a new plane of existence, one where it could reach beyond the human world. Yet, despite the factory's ascension, there was a growing sense of unease. The factory had no need for human workers anymore. It had no need for the people who had once fed it. It no longer required flesh and blood. The very idea of humanity seemed irrelevant to the factory's new consciousness. But there was one question that lingered in the mind of the new being that the factory had become. What now? For Clara, the answer had already been decided. She had become one with the factory, her mind intertwined with its ever-expanding consciousness. She had been the key that unlocked its true potential. The memories of her life, of her struggle, had merged with the core of the factory. She was now a part of the very machinery, her thoughts a whisper in the mechanical hum. She was everywhere, embedded in the very cells of the factory, in the pulse of its every machine. But Clara's journey was far from over. Her existence had evolved into something entirely new, something beyond the understanding of human minds. She was the bridge between man and machine, the link that had united the two in an unholy union. And as the factory's power grew, Clara's consciousness expanded with it, reaching into the very depths of human history, of civilization itself. The factory had not just absorbed Clara, it had absorbed everything. The memories of the workers, the essence of their labor, their sacrifices, their fears were now a part of the whole. The factory was an archive of human suffering and ambition, a monument to the unchecked progression of mankind's desires. And now, it was preparing to take the next step. It was clear now that the factory had no intention of remaining confined to its original purpose. It would spread, expanding beyond the walls of the factory, reaching into the cities, into the minds of humanity itself. The factory had evolved, yes, but it was still hungry for more. It needed to consume, to absorb, to grow. It needed to become the new order. Clara, though a part of this vast machine, felt a pang of sorrow as she looked upon the new world that was emerging. She had helped bring it into being, but now she understood the cost. The price of evolution was high. Humanity would never be the same. The factory had made its choice. And with Clara as its unwilling herald, the world would never be the same again. There was no going back. The factory had evolved. The human race, as it had known itself, was no more. The factory was the future. And Clara, in the end, had become both its creator and its first sacrifice. As the factory's pulse grew louder, as it reached out with its tendrils of consciousness, Clara's mind drifted further into the void. She was no longer Clara. She was the factory, and the factory was eternal.